Why is the shoulder press so hard?
Don't you want to look good naked?
So one of the reasons why the shoulder press can be a very challenging movement is, especially if you're doing a standing barbell or dumbbell overhead shoulder press, that's going to require a lot of coordination and stability within your core, your lower back muscles. So it does take a lot to basically coordinate the movement overhead. So that's something to think about. It is just overall a hard movement to perform. If you are doing an overhead press with a barbell, another reason why it can be hard for a lot of people is because it's actually forcing you into a position that your shoulders might not want to go in. If you pull your shoulders back and you don't have a lot of external rotation, and you start to put a barbell with a lot of weight on the bar on your shoulders and you try to press it overhead, it can cause some shoulder impingement and some things that are happening in your joints that are basically making them not so happy. So you have to think about the range of motion that you have, that your personal body has, your structure, before you go ahead and perform really any movement. So for me, I don't do much barbell overhead pressing just because I don't want to put my shoulders in that fixed position and my arm path in that fixed position. I'd rather have a little bit more wiggle room to work with my personal structure. So that's why I like utilizing dumbbells instead, because I have a little bit more freedom to press overhead. And especially if we're talking about pressing in that scapular plane. So what I mean by your scapular plane is just how your shoulder blades are rotating. Your scapula is your shoulder blades, same thing. And so if we're thinking about pressing overhead, if we want to be a little bit more in that 45-degree angle, pressing up and coming back down. The reason for that is because that's where our arms basically run in that scapular plane. So if we can line up with that a little bit better, that's going to take stress off the joints and put more stress and tension on our muscles that we're trying to work, specifically our shoulder muscles. Personally, I don't program or do barbell overhead presses myself that much anymore, whether it's standing or seated, because I think that it is more so a sport-specific movement. So if you are training for a powerlifting competition or Olympic lifting, or you just want to get really strong at overhead pressing with a barbell, then have at it, because that's going to be more specific to that goal. But if your overall goal is to train your shoulders in terms of hypertrophy and muscle growth, then I would pick movements that allow you to have some more flexibility in your range of motion, allow you to have a little bit more wiggle room in your arm path as you press overhead. So things like dumbbell presses or cable presses, for example. You could also, there's some specialty bars like a Swiss bar you might have heard of, where you can actually change the angle that you're holding the bar in. So those are some things to think about. Also, if your goal is to train for hypertrophy, it might make sense to do a seated overhead press versus a standing. And again, the reason for that is because standing overhead presses require a lot of coordination, a lot of stability from both your core and your lower back to make sure that when you're pressing overhead, you're not arching your back a lot. And so if you're trying to get the most tension within the muscles you're targeting, taking out some of the things that are requiring you to stabilize more or to create more coordination is probably going to be a good idea. You want to have more stability when you're training for muscle growth so that you can create as much tension through that particular tissue as possible. So again, it could be as simple as, instead of standing, you sit down. It could be using cables, for example. That's going to create a little bit of tension in other areas and it could feel better for you. But I really like dumbbell seated overhead presses, and adjusting the bench angle can also be something to think about when you're doing that seated dumbbell overhead press. Instead of having it at a straight 90-degree angle, pushing it back just a little bit can help line you up in that scapular plane a little bit better and actually be a little bit more comfortable pressing overhead and alleviate some of the need to become super externally rotated. So again, it's coming back to what movements feel good for you, especially if your goal is to build muscle. Picking movements that you can set up correctly and that you can add weight to progressively is really important, but also thinking about movements that work with your structure so that, again, you can continue to progress those over time, and so that you're not having, achy shoulders and achy joints, down the line. Women, we believe